You're listening to the Seven Figure Leap podcast. We're here to leverage rich relationships and smart strategies to take your business to the next level. Here's your host, Dustin Riechmann.
Your year of peace and sustainability, what does that make possible for you? We've kind of touched on it, but I'd love to thread that concept deeper of when you show up and you live in full integrity with what you teach others to do, your business expands. Like I've seen this with zero exceptions and anyone I've coached or worked with or observed. When you're in full integrity with what you teach, it tends to expand the possibility for everyone involved. So take us through a little bit about your thought leadership journey this year and where you see, this will be kind of the bridge question into next year. Like, where do you see thought leadership guiding you and the Seven Figure Leap business into 2026 and beyond?
Yeah. So as I've freed myself up through some failed experiments and some false starts, and ultimately through finding the right systems and the right team and investing in some of that self-leadership, what that has made me more available to do is the thought leadership that I feel like God has uniquely gifted me to do. Right. And so on the nose, maybe the thing that would be obvious to anyone listening to this podcast is, we teach people how to do strategic podcast guesting as a way to grow their mission-driven, expert-based business. And I've done that. And so it's not like I don't really believe in that, and I just tell other people to do it. Like I've continued to always do that. However, this year I was very intentional and I was very focused on several specific opportunities and played my own playbook to work myself into the position to be in some of those. And so two highlights I would say on the guesting side this year. Again, if you're listening to this and I was on your show, they're all awesome, but there's two that really stand out from a results standpoint. One was I was a guest on Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income podcast. That was amazing for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, because I followed Pat for like 15 years and he's someone I've admired so much forever. And so to get in that proximity with him and to be able to share some unique wisdom to his audience was great. But following that interview with me on his show, he got on my show. And then that was a really amazing podcast interview on my show. And then we found ourselves together in Boise, Idaho for Craft and Commerce. And he invited me to a private dinner that he hosted with all the other speakers. And I'm in this like speaker dinner and I'm not a speaker. And that has turned into some amazing relationships and clients. And then I got invited 3 different times to do private training in his community. So that was just a really good example of what we talk about, which is the podcast guesting is in and of itself valuable and important, but it should be, for the right relationships, just the first of many deepening versions of this relationship, or expressions, I guess, of this relationship. So the Pat Flynn story is a really important one to me this year. The other one that was by far the most financially rewarding right out of the gate was Nathan Barry. And so I had the opportunity to be on Nathan Barry's podcast, recorded that in April, and it came out in May, right before that same Craft and Commerce event, which he hosts. And I flew to Boise, did this amazing in-person interview. It's one of those, moments in your career where you walk out of there and I'm like, wow, that was it. Like, touchdown, like this, I just nailed that. Like that was so good. And it came out like the week Craft and Commerce happens. I had all these people coming up to me like, you seem familiar. And I'm like, well, I was just on Nathan's show. They're like, oh my gosh, podcast guesting. That's so great. And it has just become this incredible ripple effect this year. And I ultimately ended up having Nathan on my show, and he doesn't do a lot of podcast interviews, but he came on my show and we did a whole episode breaking down the flywheel, which is his big concept that he likes to talk about how I used his show at that point to generate 160,000 in revenue for my business, like direct booked revenue from that one podcast appearance. It's actually grown from there. So that one, I mean, is like the highlight of the year from a podcast guesting specific outcome standpoint. And now we're looking to leverage that opportunity in bigger ways, this year and heading into next. So I'd say those 2 podcast guesting interviews were monumental. The second thing I'll bring up real quick is on the hosting front, the guests I've had on this show this year, 2 big things there. One are just the caliber of thought leaders that I've had. Nathan Barry, Pat Flynn, Justin Welsh, Ryan Levesque, Jay Papasan, like these people I admire so much, have said yes to me and been here on this show and shared some really remarkable interviews and insights. The other thing I did this year that was unique, that I think, again, was an answer to a previous question of yours of scratching this itch that I used to scratch with sales calls is I did a coaching series. So I invited people to apply and come on the podcast, and I just purely coach them, sometimes for like 90 minutes, just deep dive coaching. And we release those as podcasts. And that's been really fulfilling, really unique content that I don't see anyone else doing a lot of. And so that's on the podcast hosting. And then the final thing, I mentioned this earlier, but I've done a lot of guest training this year where I've come in and hosted workshops and done guest expert training in other people's communities. And it's probably my favorite thing to do. It's sort of a one-to-many model. And I've got the opportunity to do that with some really cool thought leaders and deepen a lot of relationships in that way as well this year.